Ukraine has rejected a report by the New York Times suggesting a deadly explosion in a marketplace was caused by a Ukrainian missile. The blast happened in the eastern city of Kostiantynivka earlier in September. At least 15 people were killed and dozens injured. The New York Times says evidence collected by its journalists suggests it was the result of an errant Ukrainian air defense missile. The reporters came to the conclusion after studying missile fragments, satellite images, witness accounts, and social media posts. Ukraine blames Russia for the attack. And for more on this, I'm joined now by Isme. He's one of the reporters of the New York Times who investigated the missile attack. Welcome to our program. John, what made you and your colleagues look so closely at this one incident in particular?
Well, I think it's simply just to find out what happened. So I believe initially the Ukrainian government said that it was a interceptor missile fired from a Russian S-300 air defense system that landed in the market and killed and wounded a bunch of civilians. And so I was sent photographs. I'm based in Washington, D.C. I was sent photographs that one of our photographers had taken at the site, and they asked a simple question, what can you tell about what exploded here from these photos? And I had one candidate in mind, but asked if they could go back and take more photographs. So another colleague went there, took very detailed photographs, took measurements of the holes that were made. And by the way, this weapon exploded in a place that offered us a really interesting opportunity to collect very detailed information. There was sheet metal facades on the buildings along the street where this detonated in the middle of the street. And so it left very neat holes that were easy to measure and judge for consistency. So then we then ran through a very detailed process of trying to run down possible candidates that could have caused this damage. And it quickly sifted down to just a few candidates. And we continually evaluate those over the course of a week.
Okay, and who are those candidates? What definitive conclusion did you come to?
Well, so the first candidate I looked at was whether or not this could be an American-provided guided MLRS weapon. It's called the AW, the alternate warhead, except that weapon carries spherical preformed fragmentation that's made of tungsten. But these were not round holes. These were square and rectangular holes. The frag pattern very strongly suggested that this was an air defense weapon. The preformed fragmentation warheads are very common to those weapons because they produce a fairly consistent density of fragments in a cloud, more or less, that the target, tries to, hopefully intercept with those fragments. So the pattern was clearly stretched out in an arc, sort of a narrow banded arc across the street and running up the sides of the buildings. So to answer your question a little bit more directly, we looked at interceptor missiles that could be fired from the S-300, the S-400, 3 different missiles from the Buk launcher. Those are all Russian origin weapons, of which Ukraine does have some, the S-300 and the Buk. Then we also looked at 2 different American supplied air defense missiles, the Patriot PAC-2 and the AIM-120 AMRAAM missile.
Yeah.
But only one of those missiles had preformed fragmentation. Because again, we were able to study these personally, or my colleague in Ukraine was, and measure the fragments. And the measurements only matched for one weapon, and that was the 9M38.
Kyiv rejects your report, though. Do they have evidence to prove you're wrong?
If they do have evidence, they haven't shared it with us. So I'm unable to explain Kyiv's rationale. I will say, though, that whenever something explodes in Ukraine and kills a bunch of civilians, Russia would certainly be the first person I think anyone would rationally look to as the culprit. However, the evidence that we uncovered and analyzed and reported on simply does not support that claim.
Yeah, Ukraine is still investigating the incident, but if this indeed was a tragic mishap, as your report puts it, why wouldn't Ukraine be upfront about it? Because after all, this was an accident, if it really was, that happened while Ukraine was trying to defend itself.
I have no explanation for it. I don't know if, there aren't a lot of governments, I think, that want to publicly go back on a statement as strong as the one that Ukraine's government made at the beginning. So this is also just one incident among probably dozens, if not hundreds, across the country every day. So to focus on just one incident may not be something that they particularly felt they had the time and need to do. I can tell you that I've personally watched 3 different surface-to-air missile launches during my time as an officer in the U.S. Navy, and 2 of those weapons failed pretty spectacularly after launch. Only one, which was a much newer system, functioned properly. So I've witnessed surface-to-air missiles, malfunctioning, exploding soon after launch. I know this happens. Guided missiles are not perfect things, and we have no idea how old this weapon was, whether it had, what the potential cause for a malfunction would be. What we can say, though, is that multiple overlapping lines of evidence point to this being a tragic mistake, or sorry, a tragedy, not an intentional act.
Yeah, Ukrainian security officials say that your report fuels Russian propaganda. Now, you obviously stand by your reporting. You have heaps and heaps of proof. How do you respond to that? How do you feel about that?
It doesn't bother me. I mean, we stand by our reporting 100%. We have excellent people on the team that did this. If the government wants to say that we feed Russian propaganda, that's on them. That's their choice to characterize it that way. I think we'd prefer to have an opportunity to discuss this. We reached out to the Ukrainian government from the very beginning of our work, and they were not forthcoming in an effort to have a constructive dialogue whatsoever. So to simply ignore our outreach for, I'd say, the better part of a week, and then turn around and accuse us of feeding Russia propaganda, whether that's intentionally or not, it's really nothing I can explain. I think you'd have to ask the Ukrainians why they did it.
John Isme, thank you so much for your time, John.